Yarnspirations design team, and I'm Allie W., also from Yarnspirations. So I'll be helping you out with any questions that you might have throughout the class, and we're so excited to get started. I will turn things over to you, Seema.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. As Allie mentioned, my name's Seema, and I'm on the Yarnspirations design team. We're really excited that you have all taken the time out of your busy days to join us as we work on the Bernat crisscross stripes knit blanket. We'll give everyone like another minute or so to join. In the meanwhile, I recommend you can have some yarn ready to practice with if you like anything that you've got on hand with the matching needle size. We're using Bernat Blanket and a size US 11 8mm circular knitting needle. So for this class, you will need a circular knitting needle. If it goes a little fast, you can always rewatch this after the class. It'll be up on michaels.com/classes on YouTube. So I'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get started.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. And for anyone who doesn't have the pattern PDF, that has been dropped in the chat as well.
Perfect. And for anyone who hasn't joined one of our classes before, I'm going to walk us through the pattern for the first chunk of the class, and then Allie, who's our moderator here, will let me know of any questions that come up that I may be able to help with. And then towards the end of the class, once I'm through the pattern, I will work through some of the other class comments and chats, anything that I might have missed. So, Allie, do you think we're good to get started?
Awesome, I think so.
Okay, so Lindsay, if you don't mind switching to hands view, I will show everyone. All right, so what we've got here is a swatch of the Bernat crisscross stripes knit blanket. I've worked it here in Bernat Blanket, and I've used a size US 11 8mm circular knitting needle. We recommend one that's 36 inches long, and I do recommend using a long circular knitting needle because it's really fiddly to work if you've only got a shorter one, and a straight needle won't really work for this particular project. This is the pattern PDF printed that you should have either in your email, and they'll pop a link in the chat. As you can see here, we have noted this pattern is intermediate, so I don't want to scare off anyone who might be a recent knitter. I think if you've done a few projects and you feel comfortable with knitting needles and you know how to cast on and work in garter stitch, you'll be completely fine. But there are some techniques that are a little bit more advanced, and so I still recommend staying around and watching because it doesn't hurt to learn. And you can always practice it later if it seems a little wonky right now. But yeah, so to walk you through some of the key parts of the pattern, it's worked in a super bulky yarn, which actually makes it work up really fast and is what makes this effect, I think, so dramatic. You can see the blanket is worked side to side, or lengthwise rather, with the idea being that we cast on a lot of stitches so that it's long, 60 inches long, but of course you can work it to whatever size you need. For this particular class, I'm going to recommend, if you are going to do a swatch, you're going to need to do a multiple of 8 stitches. So for this particular swatch here, I've cast on 24 stitches, just so you can see a sizable sample. You could do 8 stitches, would be a little tiny. I would do at least 16 stitches for your cast on. Here's an example. It's a little wonky right now because I need to work a few more rows in a different yarn of 16 stitches. And you can just see, like, this is a regular bulky versus a super bulky yarn, what a difference that makes. So if you are looking to get this kind of size and effect, definitely stick to the blanket super bulky yarn. So let's get started with the pattern. I'm not going to walk you through, at least not at the start, the first 6 rows because it's garter stitch. But for anyone who might be wondering, just means that you're going to knit. you'll see here it says do not join, and that's because we're working the blanket flat. So you're just going to pretend as if these needles are straight needles and not to be, we're not forming a tube here. So that's basically what that means. So we're going to start with the 7th row, and this particular stitch, even if you don't want to use it for a blanket, I do think it could be really cool for a shawl or a scarf in a different weight, and you can basically play around with the technique once you get comfortable with it. For anyone who's wondering, this kind of elongated stitch that's exactly what it's called, elongated, but then it's also a cross stitch. And this particular pattern was actually written by my colleague Julia Medill, who said that she found this stitch a lot in stitch dictionaries from the 60s and 70s. So it's kind of cool to see it done in this particular way. So to start, the pattern says you're going to knit wrapping the yarn around the needle 4 times per stitch. So this is why I think it's a bit unusual. What that basically means is you're going to insert your needle as you would to knit, front to back, and you'll wrap the yarn around the needle, not just once, but 4 times. And it's that's 1, 2, 3, and 4. And some things to note about this. You want to make sure that you're not wrapping the yarn like on top of each other like this, because that'll just kind of change the size of your loops and stitches. And you don't want to wrap, only around the point of the needle, because what'll happen is your loops and elongated stitch will be really short and it'll be kind of hard to work, and you'll see why later on. So I recommend inserting your needle a bit further in than you might normally. And again, we're going to wrap 4 times around instead of doing just 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we'll pull all 4 of those through and slide the needle off as if to knit. So you'll see now that there are 4 loops on our needle. So to show you that again, I'm going to insert the needle from front to back, wrap the yarn once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and then slide it through and then off the needle. You don't want to pull too tight because it'll make it really hard to work your stitches later, and you don't want it too loose. Honestly, it's something you get comfortable with once you've done a bit of practice, so I do recommend doing a little swatch before you get started on the full-size blanket. So again, we'll wrap once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and then you'll see that I'm using my finger to sort of hold those loops in place. You don't have to if you've gotten comfortable, and you pull through like that. So as you can see, I am a thrower with knitter. If there are anyone who picks their yarn, I have not done that in a while, but I'll see if I can demonstrate that. So insert the needle and you would wrap once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and then pull it through and slide off. And again, insert once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and pull through. And you're just going to continue that the whole way across the row. One, 2, 3, 4. So you can start to see why a circular knitting needle is so important. You're going to have a ton of loops on your needle at this point. So it's going to get a bit squishy if you were on a shorter circular needle. 3, 4. And just going to continue that the whole way across. And this 7th row is the right side. And I'll show you after. I had started my blanket with a swatch with a slightly smaller needle, and I was pulling a little more tightly than I am now. And you can see it made it a little harder to work, and so it kind of pulled. That's why my swatch is not perfectly straight, in case you see that after. You can always try one needle size, and if you don't like how it looks, experiment with another to get gauge. Allie, are there any questions you think I can help with as I make my way across this row?
Yeah, sure. So there was a question early on about suggestions on if they want to substitute with a different yarn, a different weight yarn.
Oh, for sure. So I was using, in this other sample, Bernat Softy Chunky. I really like this particular yarn for blankets. You can see I have a large size here. This particular one, it is a super bulky, but it's has a slightly different look and not quite as bulky as blanket. The main thing is you can do a swatch with a multiple of 8 and then measure out like what the size is that you're getting for each one of these sort of X's or crosses. So like, let's say from here to here, this one cross is 2.5 inches, and I want to make my blanket 60 inches long. I would take 60 inches for the desired length, divide it by 2.5, and that would tell me how many of these X's I need. And then I would multiply the number of X's you need by 8, because each one of these is 8. So
Awesome. That's super helpful. And then LJ wants to know what does a knit thrower mean?
Oh, yes. Okay. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure what it means is some people, when they hold the yarn with their right hand, they insert their needle and they wrap the yarn around. So some people call this action throwing, as in you're throwing the yarn, versus some people hold the yarn typically in their left hand if you are right-handed. And when you insert the needle, you're picking up that yarn and pulling it through, as opposed to when I hold the yarn with my right hand, I'm throwing it around the needle. That makes sense.
Awesome. Thanks, Seema.
No worries. I'm just going to pull out that stitch to make sure that I've got 4 almost all the way through. 2, 3, 4. And we'll see if I've pulled these a little tightly. I feel like some of them, when I was demonstrating the picking, might have been pulled tightly. So we'll learn through that as well. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I like to count the wraps until, I recommend doing that until you get comfortable with it, because it's easy to lose track. And I'm probably not going to go back and count all of these loops, even though I normally would. 1, 2, 3, 4. Whoop. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then all the action happens in the next row, basically. And that's really all the 2 rows of intensity followed by 6 rows of just fun plain garter stitch. So it's a good break in between. 1, 2, slide it down a bit, 3, 4. Almost at the end there, 3 more stitches.
And Cynthia was just looking to confirm that this is an 8-stitch repeat, right?
Yes, that is correct. Can't seem to slide that off, so I'm going to redo that one. 1, 2, 3, 4. And 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we'll slide, pull that through. All right, so now you can see we finished our 7th row and there are tons of stitches on my needle. So you'll basically have 4 times the number of stitches you actually have. Now we'll turn our work for the 8th row, and the 8th row involves some setup before you actually work it. The instructions say that we're going to slip all stitches over to our right hand needle one at a time, dropping the extra wraps. So each time we wrap the yarn around our needle, that counts as a wrap, and we only want to keep one of those, and that's what gives us elongated stitches. So from back to front, so purlwise, I'm slipping the first stitch off, and I'm letting go of the following 3 wraps. So we'll demonstrate this a few times. Once, you see, now we've got like a nice elongated stitch. It's gonna feel weird if you haven't done this before, but it'll start to feel normal after a while. Then insert again and slide off. And it's kind of satisfying. You kind of hear the stitches make a little sound as it slides off your needle if your place is quiet. Sounds maybe a bit strange, but give it a go.
I will attest, when you were working on your swatch earlier, I could hear it, and I did find it very satisfying.
These are the subtle joys of knitting. So for anyone who's wanting to see that up close, insert purlwise, slide off. So you're just inserting off of the first loop and letting the 3, which counts as the stitch, and letting the other 3 loops. So this is the thing, if you work any of your loops a little tightly, this part where you've got to get it over the join between the cord and the needle can be a little sticky. Just like play with it a little to get your loops on there. And I tend to just focus on getting through 1 or a couple of stitches at a time. So as you can see, this first setup part, we're not actually knitting anything, we're just elongating the stitches and preparing it to work the cross stitch. So you can see on our right hand side here, those elongated stitches forming. This is actually a pair of new knitting needles, so the coil has not been set for anyone who works with circulars and gets annoyed. Steam over a kettle, apparently, cautiously, be very careful, or just running it under hot water from the tap can help with those kinks, but I cast on before I realized I should have done that, which I would recommend doing for this pattern. So continue sliding off. Whole way across. And there are a few variations on the way that this stitch can be worked, I think, but I find this method, as Julia has written, felt the most comfortable to me. But of course, if you find another method that works for you, whatever gives you the look. So you can see this is where I think I picked the stitches, and I'm a little tight when I hold the yarn with my left hand, which is why I don't usually. Let's see if I can get these over. All right, looks like the rest of them are sliding over okay. So, almost there. So you can see this is a perfect example of why you don't want a tight stitch, but just with a little bit of swirling it around, it'll make it over the join. love to know how else people might imagine using this stitch. I feel like a pillow maybe, if you wanted to do it on a smaller scale, and if you had a colored fabric backing, we'd make it kind of cool, make the cross design pop.
I really love that idea.
Yeah, I feel like it could have a macrame-y effect if you don't know how to macrame and just want to knit. Ooh, what have I done here? I'm scared to let this go. I think I'm going to. Yes, all good. Sometimes it's helpful to count as you're sliding the stitches off in case you get a little nervous there. So now all we've done is loosen those wraps. And what that has meant is we've got these super long loopy stitches. Now we're going to slide our needle back. So I've slid it from left to right so that I'm back to where my working yarn is. Now, the pattern has written instructions and a little diagram to help you with this next part, but I'll of course demonstrate. Essentially, you're going to work on the crosses in groups of 8, and you're going to pull stitches from left to right. So here, I'm going to bring this up close. So we've got 8 working groups of 8, and we'll take that 5th stitch and pass it over the next 4 stitches, knit that one, then we'll take the 6th stitch and pass it over that group of 4 and continue working the last 4 stitches first and then the next 4 stitches. So it's kind of like working a cable if you've ever done cable knitting. I'll of course demonstrate that now. So this is where I find having a longer needle helps. Move that out of the way so you can see. So the first thing you want to do, I would only worry about the first 8 stitches on your needle. Don't even bother with all the other loops at this time, and make sure everything is straight and that you can identify your first 8 stitches. So I've got my first 8 here, and I'll just count them from right to left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now we're going to take this 5th stitch here and slide it. You can either use your hand, which I found easy with this yarn, but you can also use your needle if you're more comfortable. You're going to pull this 5th stitch over the first 4, like so. And I'll demonstrate this again because I know it's a little weird when you see it for the first time. And then you're going to knit that 5th stitch there. And you're going to wrap the yarn around the needle twice. So not 4 times, not once, twice. So once and twice. Pull through, slide off. So you can see we've already got our first cross effect happening there. Now we're going to take the 6th stitch, so it's the one right next to the one that we just worked, and slide that over, or pass it over those 4 stitches and knit that one, wrapping twice around the needle. Then the 7th one, which is this one here, pull it over those 4, insert, wrap around twice, pull through, slide off. And then we've done 3 there. We've got 1 more. This is the last one. We slide it over the 4 here, insert, wrap the yarn twice around the needle, pull through, slide off. So we've got 4 stitches, each of which have 2 loops on our right hand needle. And then you're going to work the next 4 stitches as you see them. So just in order, 1, and you're going to continue wrapping twice around this whole row. So stitch 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's kind of hard to see on this first row, but you can see that the effect is happening. What is funny is that I've done this on the wrong row, but it doesn't really matter because it'll show you how it works, and I'll explain that after. So we're going to do the next set of 8 stitches, and I'm going to show you an alternative. Actually, I'm just going to see, do I have enough? Oh yeah, I've got enough time to show you. I'm going to show you the same method again, and then I'll show you an alternative method for working that. So get my 8 stitches in order. And actually, this is a good example. We can see, oh, actually, now they're all roughly the same height. So I'm going to take my 5th stitch here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're basically working this second set, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then we work 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll take the 5th stitch. You can use your needle if you prefer to slide it over so it's on top of those 4, and knit that one, wrapping twice. Oops, put that down for a sec. I have tangled my yarn off screen. Here we are. I don't recommend putting down your work mid-stitch on this row, maybe between a repeat, just so you don't lose count of where you are at. So we've got 3, yes, should be good. And if not, we'll learn from it. So we'll insert our needle, wrap twice, and slide it off there. Now we've got to take the 6th one, pull it over those 4 stitches, and knit that one, wrapping twice, and pull through. Then we'll take the 7th one, and again, you can use your needle if you'd preferred, then using your hand to just bring it over. Insert, wrap twice, slide off, and then 8th one. All right, so I'm just going to make sure that I've got that right because I don't want to go too far without. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's my first grouping of 8. Then 1, 2, 3, 4. Perfect. Now we're going to just work these stitches. We'll just knit them as we see them, wrapping twice around instead of once around. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now for the last 8 stitches, I'm going to demonstrate another method of working them to get the same cross effect. I will warn you that it is living on the edge, but if you feel like it, why not? It doesn't hurt to give it a try. So in this case, you'll notice that I've been pulling the stitches one at a time, and I feel like that kind of slows me down. I don't know. You can do it either way, but just make sure your 8 stitches are all, straight and that you can see them clearly. You can insert your finger or your needle through the last 4 stitches. So that's 5, 6, 7, 8. And actually, I think I'll use my needle for this. And I'm just going to take my finger and hold down the first 4 stitches and just bring this over, making sure that everything stays in order. So you can see I've already set up my stitches in this way. I'm just going to demonstrate that one more time. So I'm taking, you don't want your stitches to be doing this where you've got like stitch number 6 crossed over 8. You want to make sure that they're all straight and in order. So we've got our 8 stitches here. I'm going to lift the last 4, holding down the first 4 with my finger. It's a little fiddly, but I kind of like it. And then you've already got your 8 stitches in order, so you don't need to keep pulling it over for each one. You can just knit wrapping twice around on each one as you see it. Haven't really figured out if there's a bad side to this, maybe, but it seems to look the same way as my other stitches, so you can always give it a go. Voila. So now we're going to work, the pattern says that, you know, we've worked the first eight rows and that you're going to just continue repeating those rows. But I do want to show you the first row again, because even though it's a knit, it does look a little different than the previous ones. So when you're knitting this row, after you've done that, you're going to insert your needle, wrap just once like you normally would, pull through, and you're going to slide off that extra wrap. So each stitch has an extra wrap because remember in the previous row we were wrapping twice. So you're going to slide off, and there's basically that other loop's just going to come off. So knit and slide off, and you're losing that other loop. So you're going to do that the whole way across. And if you've made it this far and you kind of understand what's going on, congratulations. And if you haven't, I do recommend giving it a swatch, and I think I've got some time to answer questions too. So I'm going to continue knit, slide off the whole way across.
So there was a question here that I don't know if there's another solution to, but they couldn't find which of their circulars were an 11 because they weren't marked. Is there any tricks besides using a gauge check?
Yes. If you have a ruler, you can kind of, it's very fiddly, but pretend this is a flat ruler and not a measuring tape. You can put your needle, hold it up against the measuring tape. And if you use millimeters, I find, I mean, I'm in Canada, in case you didn't know, and so inches for me are a little fiddly here, but really I want to know how many millimeters, because a US 11 is an 8 millimeter. So if I hold it up over the centimeter side, I can see that this is approximately 8 millimeters. So you should be able to do that. It does get trickier when you get down to like a 2.25 millimeter needle or something, but for the larger needle sizes, this should give you a good idea.
That is a fantastic tip.
It has helped me in many a time.
And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll make sure to get to them.
Yeah, and I'd love to know what people think about this stitch, like whether they can see it using it for other applications.
So Luann had a question about what's the best way to weave ends when finishing. With a bulky yarn like this, does weaving in the end show up more?
Right. I don't think weaving in shows up more. I actually find blanket in particular very forgiving because of the chenille texture. I don't think I've got one beside me, but there are tapestry needles that have, they're plastic, and I'll just kind of draw out the shape. So because they're plastic, it makes them super bendable, but the shape is kind of just like a needle, but this entire thing is open and it's not just a little eye. So I have seen that at Michael's before, but yeah, it's just a large loop that's bendable plastic, and that can, you know, makes it really easy to thread the yarn through. If you do have a sewing, like if you happen to have a sewing kit, usually those ones with the little metal circle, that can help you as well if you insert that into your tapestry needle to get the yarn through. My major thing about when you're weaving in ends, is to just give yourself long enough tails. So like if you have to change thread, or even at the start of your project, I mean, this is a bit longer than you really need, but give yourself at least, 6 to 7 inches so you've got enough to work with. And make sure you're working in one direction, like, I actually tend to do about 3 inches, but 2 inches is probably okay. And then 1 inch back in the opposite direction. And that way it's really secure, because if you've just woven in and out of your garter stitch this way, if anything happens, it could open, but if by going back just a couple of centimeters or an inch or two, will just really hold it in place. And my last suggestion is to make sure that you're weaving in and out of existing stitches, and don't jump many rows when you're weaving in and out. Try to stay like in a pathway that feels natural. So I'm just continuing across here, knitting that first bit and then sliding off that extra loop.
There are 2 questions that came through about adding another ball of yarn.
Yeah. Just tips?
Just how do you add a new ball? How would you add a new ball of yarn?
For sure. For this particular pattern, I would not add a new ball of yarn in the middle of this cross part. I think it would just make life a little bit more difficult. So if you see that you're running out of yarn and you need to start your new ball, I would try to do it in the 6 rows of garter. I'm almost there, so through this row. So I'll see if I can demonstrate with some other yarn I've got hanging around. Did I do that right? For the sake of the tutorial, we'll continue. Something there is a little wonky, but and before I forget, I just wanted to note, if you were paying attention, you might have noticed that, hey, the first set of crosses that I'd done before I started the class are all in the right direction. This one in particular that I worked during the class, I worked on the wrong side. So, count your stitches, your rows as you work. I sort of stopped my tally during the class, and clearly that, happened. But to be honest, the stitch looks cool on both sides, so it doesn't, for a swatch, it doesn't bother me, but I think for your blanket, you'd want to be intentional about it, and either have it rotating or just work it exactly as the pattern has it, and all of them will be in this particular direction. And this, ignoring the top row, would be the right side, where all of them are angling to the right. And I'm just going to grab some other yarn to demo weaving or joining a new ball. There are varying schools of thought about whether you should join at the end of a row or join in the middle of a row. I am not really wed to either. It depends. If it was like a sweater and I have to seam the ends of my rows, like the edges here, together with another piece, I might want to join my yarn in the middle of a row just to avoid any extra bulk on the right here. But in this particular case, it's a blanket. I'm, possibly decorating the ends with tassels, so I don't mind joining at the end here. So usually what I would do is I would cut my yarn. So give myself about 6 to 8 inches, cut there. Then I would insert as if to knit, and you actually are, and I would just take my new yarn, wrap it over as I normally would, give myself a long enough tail there as well, and then just start knitting with that second yarn. Make sure that you're not using the tail, but that you're grabbing the end from the ball. And I'm just doing this in a different color so you can see what that looks like. And actually, I feel like a 2-color version of this blanket could be really cool for another layer of striping. What you will notice is that this end here might seem a little loose. Some things I like to do usually when I'm working, and if I'm not going to bother weaving in right away, is I'll loosely very loosely, tie a knot. Personal preference is not to have knots, but I know some people who tie really good ones and they make it work. So I would just loosely tie that, and then at the end of your project, or whenever you decide to weave in ends, if you work on them as you go, I would open it back out and then weave in those ends. Ooh, I've only got a tiny tapestry needle here, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to demo that properly. Oh, actually, well, managed to make it its way through, so hey, hurrah.
Success.
This is a really bad spot for me to be doing this because I haven't worked another row of the garter stitch to weave it through, but once you weave in and out, that'll really keep it in place. Another option is you can do that in the middle of a row, like just right here. Just start with a new, I'm going to pretend this gray is a new ball of yarn, and just as long as you've got a long enough tail, you can tuck that in after. I know there are I have seen some people say that they'll start knitting with both yarns, and then in a later row, they'll knit two together so that it's super secure in place. So for example, I'm gonna just undo a couple of stitches so it's a little clearer what I mean. What have I done here? All right, so say for example, I'm joining again here. I could, if I wanted, take my new yarn. So I could knit with my old yarn that I'm finishing and my new yarn, lay that across and pull through. And you've got two on your needle here. And then just drop the old yarn and continue with your new yarn. And then when you're coming back to that stitch on the following row, you'll just work this stitch as if it's one with your new color, and that'll just really keep it in place. Usually I don't find, you might be concerned about it being super visible if it were different colors, but for the same color you probably won't notice it, and it'll really hold it in place. Back to where I was. And I was going to show, I'm going to continue working on this swatch that I started right before the class in Bernat Softy Chunky. And you can just see how in a different yarn, like one with more stitch definition in this particular case, you can really see the lines that the cross stitch makes. And if you were doing this in Bernat Blanket in a variegated tone, it would also be super cool because then these particular lines could take on different hues. Cool. I'm just seeing if I can pull up the chat now because sometimes I don't look at it during the class so I can help everyone out. But
there was a question here from Lena about if she wanted to do a pillow, do you know how many stitches she would need to start with?
Sure. Lena, I'll pretend that you're using Bernat Blanket. It depends on what yarn you're using, but the idea will apply to both. I'm just gonna turn to a page. So we know that 8 stitches, it's the same idea actually for changing the length of the blanket. So we know that 8 stitches in this particular case, oh, why don't I measure it? So find out how much one of these sets measures for you. For the sake of right now, I'm just going to say 3 inches from left to right. So 8 stitches, and my pen's running out. Grab a different one. Okay, 8 stitches / 1 pattern repeat equals 3 inches. let's say you're making a standard square pillow and it is 18 inches is what we want. We'll say, we'll do the number of stitches per repeat divided by how much that is in inches, 3 inches, multiply it by 18. I'm not going to do the math. That will give, because I will get it wrong on camera. That's just how that works. But it'll give you a certain number of stitches, but that number needs to be a multiple of 8. So either round up or round down to get closer, as close, to get to a multiple of 8. So 8, 16, 24, and so forth. Hopefully that formula.
Awesome. Ronnie said 48.
48. All right. I trust you. I'm not going to check you. I'll check after.
Math's not my expertise either.
It is. I just, you know, fluster on camera.
Oh, that's totally fine. Lena said, thank you so much.
Awesome. I'm going to, and it's the same thing, like if you wanted a 20-inch with, you know, same idea.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Definitely a lot of people here saying that this has been a really clear instructions and that they've really been enjoying the class. Any other questions here about the techniques explained or this pattern? We have time to cover some questions. So please feel free to ask away in the chat here.
Yeah, and I'll, until any new questions come up, I will just give some other suggestions. When I was working on this particular prep for the class, because it was written by my colleague Julia, so I hadn't tried this stitch until yesterday, even though I've been knitting for many years. I can't even count. What I did think was cool is you could really play with this with different yarns and blanket, you know, wrapping the yarn around your needle 3 times or 2 times to sort of see, you know, if you wrap it only twice, that'll change the height, but it would still give you a cross effect. And on the return row, when you're on the 8th row where you're wrapping twice, you could also just knit normally and see what happens. So it's kind of a fun exercise, and you also don't even have to cross, like if you were doing a scarf and you wanted that drop effect, especially for like a lacy summer tunic or something. I see, oh, any other finish or add-ons you would suggest. So for this particular pattern, and I actually totally love this, I love a good tassel. What Julia has done is she suggested putting a tassel, as you can see, it's worked lengthwise. So to sort of accentuate the columns here, a tassel has been placed usually at every garter stitch section, or you could do it at every cross section, or however you choose. For this particular one, I'm going to see if I have any cardboard. Oh, I don't, but we can use my notebook. I can demonstrate how you would do that. So in this particular case, for the pattern, you're going to wind yarn around a piece of cardboard that is 6 inches wide if you want it to be the size demonstrated in the pattern, 5 times. So we're gonna detangle the yarn here. Maybe I'll just cut it for the sake of time. So did I cut the right section? No. All right, here we go again. So if this were a piece of cardboard that was 6 inches wide, be close actually, we'll just wrap. And when you're making a tassel, don't pull too tightly because that'll change the length of all your tassel parts. So 1, 2, 3, really tangled here, 4, and 5. So, say that's our 5. And then for this one, we're going to tie through the loops securely at one end. Okay, so I'm going to cut this yarn. sorry about that. And then I'm going to take, you'll see in the diagram, we're going to thread another piece of yarn through the loops at the top there, and that'll join the tassels. So I'm going to give myself more than I probably need. Please, have my stand there. You can slide it under those 5 and get it to the top there, and then do a loose tie, or actually it shouldn't be too loose, but just secure enough. That keeps it in place. And then there are 2 options. You can cut the bottom here. I find for blanket, if you want a really durable tassel, you don't have to do that. You can then take another piece of yarn and wrap around where you want. So I like a good chunky tassel, so you could wrap like 10 times or 20 times around your piece of cardboard. Basically form a loop around, kind of doing this in a bit of a rush, so it's not as neat as I would like, but, and then you can wrap it, let's see, the pattern calls for 6 times around the tassel 2 inches down. So that'll kind of give you sort of bigger puffy area. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can kind of see the tassel shape. It kind of looks like a little ghost that we used to make in Halloween. I don't know why it makes me think of that. And you would then weave in this end. And then at the end here, the loops, I think actually, probably I'm going to cut it. So just slide your scissors in if you haven't, you would typically do this while it's still on the cardboard, and cut off those bits. And then, of course, when you're finished all your tassels, I would then trim at that point to make sure that they're all the same length. And what's handy if you've left yourself that tie is that you can, you know, thread it through. Because it's blanket, I just find it easy to use my hands to sort of find the spot that I want to attach it. But you can also use a needle and do a bit of a, you can do a double knot if you're concerned, and then weave in those ends like you normally would. And I mean, this was a really rushed tassel, but you can kind of get the idea from there. Perfect. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We've been running classes every week, knitting and crochet. So definitely check out michaels.com/classes for more class ideas. And if you have any suggestions too about things that you want us to cover in future classes, it doesn't hurt. We definitely love checking that out as well.
Thank you so much, Seema. We still have a few minutes. If anyone has any last minute questions, we can try and get to those, but thank you all so much. And just as a reminder, this class will be available online. I'm going to drop the link here in the chat so that you have it, so that you can go back and rewatch at your leisure, pause, rewind, speed up. And then, of course, you can sign up for more classes at michaels.com/online classes. We have knit and crochet classes every week. And then we also have bonus. Michaels also has a slew of other classes for, really any area that you might be interested in. So please definitely feel free to check those out.
Yeah, and I love seeing what everyone's working on. So #MakeItWithMichaels and #YourInspirations usually lets us see those projects if you're sharing them on Instagram or on Facebook pages. I was gonna find my tapestry needle, but the knitter's dilemma, always misplaced. Perfect.
Pavani just had a question here about whether or not you would be able to replace circulars with straight needles for a blanket.
It's really tricky. What ends up happening, Pavani, is that the knitting needles will just get really crowded with your stitches for most blankets. And chances are you probably won't be able to fit them unless you've got like 18-inch needles or something to keep them up, and it'll really put a lot of pressure on your hands to keep the weight of that blanket as well if you can manage to squish it on. It does work if you're doing blankets that are made in panels. So if this was just the width of your project and it was a different stitch, then you could. The reason it wouldn't really work for this particular blanket as well is because there is that action where we slide the stitches from one end of the needle to the other to work on it. So you wouldn't be able to do that if you were on a straight set of needles. So for this pattern in particular, you really do. I was thinking that if anyone wants to get creative, you could experiment with, instead of, and I apologize, I'm saying this at the end when there might be no time to explain, but instead of, you know, unhooking each stitch and then sliding it back to this side and then knitting them, I'm wondering if you could open the loops as you go. So like open 8, slide it back onto your needle, and then you know, see a question about what would happen if you use a 10 needle instead of an 11. It'll be a bit tighter. So here's this beginning part here. I used, I happen to have a 7.5, which is that rare size. And it definitely was a lot tighter than when I used an 8mm here. So you can see it just affects, it also depends on how tightly you hold your needles. If you're a loose knitter, an 8mm might be, or a US 11 might be too big for you, and you might need a US 10. When you go from row 8, where you wrap 2 times, back to row 1 to knit all across, do you drop the wrap stitch as you go? Yes, Liz, that's correct. As you're working row 1, you're going to knit that first loop that you see. I think I've already done it on this row. And then let go of that second wrap. And if you need a replay, just definitely check out the YouTube version after, and that'll help for sure. Somehow there's yarn everywhere. That happens.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Seema, and thank you everybody for joining the class today. And of course, don't forget to check us out with more classes.
For sure. Thank you everyone for joining us. Can't wait for the next one. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.